A wooden pillar stood in the center of the Munich beer hall, 8 meters tall, supporting the ceiling where Adolf Hitler would stand to deliver his annual speech on November 8, 1939. For 30 consecutive nights, a carpenter named Georg Elser worked alone in the darkness, carving into that pillar's core with nothing but hand tools, sawdust falling like snow around his feet, each scrape of the chisel a potential death sentence. He was not a soldier, not a spy, not a member of any resistance group. He was a furniture maker from a small village, a man who built cabinets and repaired clocks, a man whose hands knew wood better than they knew violence. But Georg Elser had made a decision that would place him at the center of one of the most audacious assassination attempts in modern history, a plan so precise, so patient, and so dangerously close to success that it would haunt the Nazi regime for years to come. The beer hall was called the Bürgerbräukeller, and every November Hitler returned there to commemorate the failed coup of 1923, the moment that had launched his rise to absolute power. The speech was a ritual, a celebration of Nazi mythology, attended by the inner circle of the Third Reich. Hermann Göring would be there, Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, all the architects of the coming war. It was the one night of the year when the most powerful men in Germany gathered in a single room, predictable as clockwork, vulnerable in ways they never were inside the Reich Chancellery. Georg Elser understood this. He had been watching, studying, planning for over a year. He knew that if he could place a bomb inside that pillar, timed to detonate during Hitler's speech, he could decapitate the Nazi leadership in a single explosion. The problem was that the pillar was solid oak, reinforced with iron bands, and he would need to hollow out a cavity large enough to hold 30 kilograms of explosives without anyone noticing. Munich in 1939 was a city holding its breath. The invasion of Poland had begun in September, and the world was sliding into a war that would consume 50 million lives. Inside Germany, the machinery of totalitarianism had reached its peak. The Gestapo was everywhere. Informants lurked in every neighborhood, and even a careless word could lead to arrest, torture, or execution. To resist was to accept death. Not just for yourself, but for your family, your friends, anyone who had ever shown you kindness. Most Germans had chosen silence, collaboration, or enthusiastic support. The few who resisted did so in secret, in small acts of defiance that rarely changed anything. Georg Elser was not content with small acts. He had watched his country descend into madness, had seen the brown shirts march through his village, had heard the radio broadcasts promising glory and conquest. He had decided that if no one else would stop this, he would. Georg had been born in Hermeringen, a quiet town in southern Germany, the son of a farmer who drank too much and a mother who prayed too little. He had learned carpentry as a boy, discovered he had a gift for precision, for seeing how things fit together. He was not particularly educated, not political in any formal sense, but he read the newspapers, listened to the speeches, and understood what was coming. By 1938, he had concluded that Hitler would lead Germany into a catastrophic war, that millions would die, and that the only way to prevent it was to kill the Führer before the machinery of destruction became unstoppable. He began to plan. He studied explosives, learning from old mining manuals and military texts. He stole gunpowder from a quarry where he had worked, smuggling it out in small amounts over months. He tested detonators in the woods, far from anyone who might hear. The Bürgerbräukeller was not heavily guarded outside of the annual event. During the rest of the year, it was just another beer hall, a place where workers drank and ate sausages. Georg began visiting in the spring of 1939, eating meals there, observing the layout, memorizing every detail. He noticed the pillar, the way it stood directly behind the speaker's podium, the way the gallery above would amplify the blast. He calculated angles, estimated weights, and realized that if he could pack enough explosives into the core of that pillar, the entire ceiling would collapse onto Hitler and his entourage. The challenge was access. The hall closed at midnight, and the morning staff arrived at 6. That gave him 6 hours, but he needed to work over many nights to carve out the space he needed, without leaving obvious evidence. In early August, Georg made his move. He began staying late at the beer hall, hiding in a storage closet after closing time. When the last worker left and the doors were locked, he emerged with his tools, a small flashlight, and a cloth to muffle the sound. He worked the pillar like a surgeon, cutting inch by inch into the oak, removing the wood in careful sections so he could replace the outer shell and hide his work. Night after night, he returned, each session a gamble that a night watchman would not hear him, that a cleaner would not notice the fresh sawdust, that his absence from his rented room would not raise suspicion. 30 nights, 30 chances to be caught. 30 steps closer to a moment that would either change history or end in his silent execution. By late October of 1939, Georg Elser had completed the excavation. The cavity inside the pillar was perfect, a hidden chamber measuring 40 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters deep, large enough to hold the bomb mechanism he had constructed in his small rented room across the city. He had covered the opening with a wooden panel that matched the pillar's surface so precisely that even close inspection revealed nothing unusual. The sawdust had been swept away, the tools hidden, and the evidence of 30 nights of criminal labor had vanished into the grain of the wood. But now came the most dangerous phase of the operation. He needed to assemble the bomb inside the pillar, install the timing mechanism, and set the detonation for November 8 at 2015, the exact moment when Hitler would be 15 minutes into his speech, when the hall would be packed with the Nazi elite, when the exits would be blocked by the crowd. Georg had no training in bomb making beyond what he had taught himself, no backup plan if the mechanism failed, and no illusion about what would happen if the Gestapo caught him before the timer ran out. The bomb itself was a masterpiece of improvisation. Georg had spent months gathering components, each piece acquired through careful planning to avoid suspicion. The explosive core consisted of 120 sticks of dynamite, stolen incrementally from the quarry where he had once worked, each theft requiring him to falsify inventory records and bribe a sympathetic foreman who asked no questions. He had packed the dynamite into 2 wooden boxes lined with lead to contain the blast direction, ensuring maximum upward force into the ceiling. The detonator was a converted alarm clock, modified with wires and a battery, to trigger the explosion at a preset time. Georg had tested similar devices in the forest outside Munich, timing each explosion to the second, refining the mechanism until he was certain it would not fail. He understood that precision was everything. If the bomb detonated too early, Hitler would not yet be in position. If it detonated too late, the speech would be over, and the Führer would be safely back in his armored car, surrounded by SS guards who would seal the city and hunt down anyone connected to the attack. The timing mechanism required constant adjustment. Georg visited the beer hall again in early November, this time during daylight hours, blending in with the crowds as preparations began for the annual commemoration. He watched as workers hung swastika banners from the ceiling, positioned the podium, and tested the microphones. He noted the exact placement of the speaker's platform, confirmed that it remained directly in front of the pillar, and calculated the blast radius one final time. The bomb would need to detonate with enough force to collapse the gallery above, bringing down tons of wood and plaster onto the Nazi leadership below. He estimated that everyone within a 10-meter radius of the pillar would be killed instantly, and that the shockwave would injure or kill dozens more in the surrounding area. It would be a massacre, but Georg had made peace with that. He had concluded that the lives of a few dozen Nazi officials were worth sacrificing to prevent the deaths of millions in the war he knew was coming. On November 5th, 3 days before the planned detonation, Georg returned to the beer hall one last time. He waited until after midnight, slipped into the storage closet, and emerged when the building was silent. He opened the hidden panel in the pillar, carefully installed the bomb mechanism, connected the wires to the detonator, and set the timer. The clock began ticking, a soft mechanical heartbeat counting down the hours until history would either change or continue on its catastrophic path. Georg replaced the panel, swept away the final traces of his work, and left the building before dawn. He did not return to his rented room. He knew that if the bomb succeeded, the Gestapo would tear Munich apart looking for the person responsible, and that staying in the city would be suicide. Instead, he packed a small bag, purchased a train ticket to the Swiss border, and prepared to disappear into the chaos that would follow the explosion. The days leading up to November 8 were agonizing. Georg moved through the city like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, speaking to no one, sleeping in cheap hostels where questions were not asked. He read the newspapers obsessively, looking for any sign that the bomb had been discovered, that the speech had been cancelled, that his months of work had been for nothing. But the papers reported only the usual Nazi propaganda, announcements of the upcoming commemoration, promises of a glorious future for the Reich. On the morning of November 8, Georg boarded a train heading west toward the border. He carried forged identity papers, a small amount of cash, and the knowledge that in less than 12 hours the bomb would detonate. He did not know if Hitler would die, if the plan would succeed, or if he would live long enough to cross into Switzerland. All he knew was that the timer was running and that nothing could stop it now. The train departed Munich at 11 in the morning, carrying Georg Elser toward the border town of Constance, where Switzerland lay just across the Rhine River. He sat in a third-class compartment, surrounded by workers and farmers, his face pressed against the window as the Bavarian countryside rolled past in shades of autumn gold and brown. The journey would take approximately 9 hours, which meant he would reach the border around 8 in the evening, 2 hours before the bomb was set to explode. Georg had timed his escape with the same precision he had applied to the assassination itself, calculating that by the time the Gestapo began hunting for suspects, he would already be across the frontier, hidden in the neutral safety of Swiss territory. But escapes rarely go according to plan, and the border between Nazi Germany and Switzerland in November of 1939 was one of the most heavily patrolled stretches of frontier in Europe, guarded by suspicious customs officers who had been trained to spot anyone fleeing the Reich. Georg carried almost nothing that could connect him to the bombing. His tools had been discarded in a river weeks earlier. The stolen dynamite was now sitting inside the pillar at the Bürgerbräukeller, and his forged papers identified him as a factory worker traveling to visit relatives near the border. But he had made one critical mistake, a small oversight that would prove catastrophic. In his coat pocket, he carried sketches and technical drawings of the bomb mechanism, notes he had kept throughout the planning process to ensure the detonator would function correctly. He had intended to burn these papers before leaving Munich, but in the rush to catch the train he had forgotten. Now those drawings sat folded in his pocket, a signed confession waiting to be discovered by anyone who decided to search him. Georg did not realize this mistake as the train moved west, did not feel the weight of the evidence pressing against his chest, did not understand that his fate was already sealed before the bomb had even detonated. Back in Munich, the Bürgerbräukeller was filling with Nazi officials and party faithful. The annual commemoration of the 1923 putsch was one of the most important events on the Nazi calendar, a ritual of loyalty and triumph that reinforced Hitler's mythological status as the savior of Germany. By early evening, the hall was packed with over 3,000 people, all standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the swastika banners, waiting for the Führer to arrive. The pillar stood exactly where it had always stood, a silent monument of oak and iron, its hidden cargo ticking steadily toward 2015. Security was tight, but routine. The SS had swept the building earlier in the day, checking for obvious threats, but they had not thought to inspect the structural columns, had not imagined that someone could spend 30 nights carving a bomb into the very architecture of the hall. The Nazi leadership believed themselves invincible, protected by fear and absolute power, unable to conceive that a lone carpenter could threaten their empire. Hitler arrived at the beer hall at 2000 hours, 15 minutes later than usual. The delay was caused by fog that had grounded his plane, forcing him to travel by train from Berlin, a journey that had left him irritated and behind schedule. He entered the hall to thunderous applause, climbed onto the podium, and began his speech exactly at 2013. The crowd listened in reverent silence as he recounted the story of the failed coup 16 years earlier, how he and his followers had marched through Munich demanding power, how the police had opened fire, how martyrs had fallen for the cause. Hitler's voice echoed through the hall, amplified by microphones, his words carried by radio to millions of Germans listening at home. He spoke of destiny, of sacrifice, of the inevitable triumph of the Aryan race. Behind him, hidden inside the pillar, the timer continued its countdown, seconds ticking away toward the moment that would either end the Third Reich or confirm its invincibility. At 2021, 6 minutes after the scheduled detonation time, Hitler abruptly ended his speech. He had been scheduled to speak until 2030, but the fog and the late start had forced him to cut the event short. He needed to return to Berlin that night, and the weather was worsening. Without explanation, he thanked the crowd, raised his arm in salute, and left the podium. The Nazi leadership followed him out of the hall, moving quickly toward the waiting cars outside. By 2025, Hitler was in his armored Mercedes, driving through the dark streets of Munich toward the train station. The Bürger Bräukeller remained packed with lower-ranking party members, old comrades from the early days of the movement, people who had stayed behind to drink and celebrate. The pillar stood silent among them, its clock still ticking, indifferent to the fact that its primary target had just escaped. At 2020, exactly 9 minutes after Hitler had scheduled the detonation, the bomb exploded with a force that tore through the Bürger Bräukeller like the fist of an angry god. The pillar disintegrated in a flash of fire and splintered oak, sending a shockwave outward that collapsed the gallery ceiling directly above where Hitler had been standing minutes earlier. Tons of wood, plaster and iron beams crashed down onto the podium, burying it under a mountain of debris. The blast shattered every window in the hall, blew out the front doors, and sent fragments of the building scattering across the street outside. The lights went out instantly, plunging the interior into darkness broken only by the orange glow of flames that began spreading through the wreckage. Screams filled the air as survivors stumbled through the smoke, their ears ringing from the concussion, their clothes covered in dust and blood. 8 people died in the immediate aftermath, crushed by falling beams or torn apart by the explosion itself. 63 others were injured, some critically, their bodies mangled by shrapnel and debris, but Adolf Hitler was not among them. The realization that Hitler had survived spread through Nazi Germany like electricity through a wire. Within minutes of the explosion, SS commanders were on the phone to Berlin, confirming that the Führer was alive, unhurt, and already boarding his train back to the capital. Goebbels immediately began crafting the narrative, transforming the assassination attempt into proof of Hitler's divine protection, evidence that fate itself had chosen him to lead Germany to victory. The propaganda machine roared to life, radio broadcasts announcing that the Führer had been saved by Providence, that his early departure had been guided by an unseen hand, that the enemies of the Reich had failed because God was on Germany's side. Hitler himself embraced this mythology, later claiming that he had felt an inexplicable urge to leave early, a premonition that had saved his life. The truth was more mundane. He had simply needed to catch a train because of bad weather. But in the fevered logic of Nazi Germany, there was no room for mundane truths. Everything had to be destiny. Everything had to be part of the grand narrative of Aryan supremacy and inevitable triumph. The Gestapo response was immediate and savage. Heinrich Himmler ordered a nationwide manhunt for the person responsible, mobilizing thousands of agents to tear Germany apart looking for suspects. Roadblocks were erected at every border crossing, train stations were flooded with plainclothes officers, and anyone attempting to leave the country was subjected to intense interrogation. The assumption was that the attack had been orchestrated by a foreign power, probably Britain or the Soviet Union, using German communists or resistance cells as proxies. The idea that a single individual, working entirely alone, could have planned and executed such a sophisticated attack seemed impossible to the Nazi leadership. They were hunting for a conspiracy, a network of saboteurs, an organized resistance movement. They were not looking for a carpenter from a small village who had simply decided that Hitler needed to die. Georg Elser reached the border crossing at Konstanz at 20:45, approximately 24 minutes after the bomb had detonated in Munich. He had no way of knowing whether the explosion had killed Hitler, whether his months of work had succeeded or failed, whether he was now the assassin of the century or simply a fugitive with blood on his hands and nothing to show for it. He approached the customs checkpoint on foot, carrying his small bag, his forged papers ready, his face carefully composed into an expression of bored routine. The Swiss border lay less than 100 meters away, visible across the darkened river, a line between captivity and freedom that thousands of refugees had tried to cross since the war began. Most had failed. The Nazi guards at Konstanz had orders to stop anyone suspicious, and in November of 1939 everyone was suspicious. Georg handed his papers to the customs officer, a young man in a grey uniform who barely glanced at them before waving him toward a secondary inspection area. The search was routine at first, a perfunctory check of his bag and pockets, the kind of procedure that happened 100 times a day at border crossings across the Reich. But then the officer found the drawings. He pulled the folded papers from Georg's coat pocket, unfolded them under the harsh light of the inspection booth, and stared at the technical sketches of timing mechanisms, detonators, and explosive charges. His face changed. He called for his supervisor, who called for the Gestapo, who arrived within 15 minutes, black leather coats and dead eyes, men who specialized in finding enemies of the state. They took Georg into a back room, stripped him, searched him again, and found more evidence he had forgotten to destroy. Within an hour of his arrest, the Gestapo knew they had found someone connected to the Munich bombing. By midnight, they had begun the interrogation that would last for days, an interrogation that would reveal the impossible truth that this lone carpenter had nearly changed the course of World War II. The interrogation began in a windowless room in the Konstanz Gestapo headquarters, but within 24 hours, Georg Elser had been transported to Munich, then to Berlin, where the most skilled interrogators in the Reich took over the questioning. They beat him with fists and batons, broke his ribs, shattered his fingers, subjected him to sleep deprivation and psychological torture designed to break even the strongest will. But Georg told them the truth from the beginning, a truth so simple and so audacious that his interrogators refused to believe it. He had worked alone. There was no conspiracy, no foreign handlers, no network of resistance fighters. He was a carpenter who had decided that killing Hitler was necessary to prevent a catastrophic war, and he had spent over a year planning the assassination with the same meticulous care he would apply to building a grandfather clock. The Gestapo could not accept this. They needed a conspiracy, needed proof of British intelligence or communist saboteurs, needed something that fit their understanding of how the world worked. A lone craftsman nearly killing the Führer through sheer determination and technical skill was incomprehensible to men who believed in the superiority of the Nazi state apparatus. For weeks, the interrogations continued, each session more brutal than the last. Georg was shown photographs of the destroyed beer hall, told that 8 innocent Germans had died in the blast, asked repeatedly who had helped him, who had provided the explosives, who had given him the plan. He answered the same way every time. No one helped him. He had stolen the dynamite himself from the quarry. He had learned bomb-making from books. He had chosen the target, planned the timing, and executed the entire operation without assistance or encouragement from any person or organization. The interrogators brought in experts, bomb technicians and engineers who examined the remnants of the device and confirmed that it showed remarkable sophistication, precision that seemed beyond the capabilities of an untrained civilian. Yet Georg demonstrated his knowledge in detail, explaining the clock mechanism, the detonator design, the calculations he had made to ensure maximum destructive force. Slowly, reluctantly, the Gestapo began to accept that they had captured not a foreign agent, but something far more dangerous, a common man who had nearly succeeded where professional assassins had failed. Hitler himself took a personal interest in the case. He ordered that Georg be kept alive, refusing to allow his immediate execution despite the demands of Himmler and other Nazi officials who wanted a public trial and hanging to demonstrate the consequences of treason. Hitler wanted to understand how a simple carpenter had come so close to killing him, wanted to study this enemy who had worked alone in the darkness for 30 nights, carving a grave into a wooden pillar. There were rumors that Hitler intended to keep Georg imprisoned until after the war, planning to put him on trial in a grand show of Nazi justice once Germany had conquered Europe. Georg was transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, then later to Dachau, where he was held in special isolation, separated from other prisoners, given better food and treatment than most inmates, kept alive as a curiosity, a specimen of failed resistance that the Führer wanted to preserve. The German public never learned the full story of Georg Elser's assassination attempt. The Nazi propaganda machine suppressed the details, afraid that the truth would inspire other lone actors, other carpenters or teachers or factory workers who might decide that they too could strike at the heart of the Reich. The official narrative claimed that the bombing had been carried out by British intelligence using German communists, a foreign attack on German soil that proved the cowardice of Germany's enemies. Georg's name was erased from newspapers, his existence denied, his near success transformed into proof of Nazi invincibility rather than evidence of the regime's vulnerability. Only the inner circle of the Nazi leadership knew how close they had come to annihilation, how a few minutes of fog and bad weather had saved Hitler's life, how the entire course of the war had hinged on a train schedule and an impatient dictator's decision to leave a speech early. In the concentration camps where Georg was held, he became a ghost among ghosts, a prisoner whose crime was known only to his guards and the camp commandants. Other inmates whispered about him, wondering what he had done to deserve such special treatment, why he was kept isolated and alive while thousands around him were worked to death or sent to the gas chambers. Georg said nothing, built furniture when ordered to, repaired clocks and machinery, and waited for a war he knew was coming to its inevitable conclusion. He had failed to prevent the conflict, failed to kill Hitler, failed to save the millions who would die in the years ahead. But he had tried, and in that attempt, he had proven that even under totalitarianism, even in the heart of absolute power, resistance was possible. One man working alone had nearly changed history. The years Georg Elser spent in captivity unfolded in a strange limbo between life and death, neither executed nor freed, held as Hitler's personal prisoner in a system designed to erase human beings from existence. At Sachsenhausen and later at Dachau, he was assigned prisoner number and given a wooden bunk in a cell separated from the general population, a precaution the SS took to prevent him from becoming a symbol or inspiration to other inmates. His guards treated him with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect, aware that this quiet man had accomplished what entire armies and intelligence services had failed to do. He was allowed small privileges that other prisoners could only dream of: extra food rations, occasional access to tools, permission to work in the camp workshops where his carpentry skills made him useful to the SS officers who wanted furniture built or clocks repaired. But these privileges came with a price. Georg knew he was being kept alive not out of mercy, but because Hitler wanted him available for a show trial after Germany won the war, a public spectacle where the failed assassin would be paraded before the world as proof of Nazi supremacy. Outside the barbed wire and watchtowers of Dachau, the war Georg had tried to prevent consumed Europe with unprecedented savagery. Poland fell in weeks, France collapsed in months, and the Wehrmacht swept across the continent like a mechanized plague, leaving millions dead in its wake. The Blitz hammered London, Operation Barbarossa drove into the Soviet Union, and the Holocaust machinery began its systematic murder of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable by Nazi racial ideology. Georg heard fragments of news from guards, from new prisoners arriving at the camp, from the distant sound of Allied bombers passing overhead as the war turned against Germany. He understood that his failure at the Bürgerbräukeller had cost the world dearly, that those 9 minutes, that single fog-delayed departure, had allowed Hitler to continue the nightmare that was now devouring civilization. The knowledge haunted him through the endless days of imprisonment, the awareness that if the bomb had detonated on schedule, if Hitler had stayed just 15 minutes longer, tens of millions of lives might have been saved. By 1943, the tide of war had shifted decisively against Nazi Germany. Stalingrad had fallen, the Afrika Korps had surrendered, and Allied forces were pushing north through Italy while preparing for the inevitable invasion of France. Inside the concentration camps, the SS began destroying evidence of their crimes, burning documents, dismantling gas chambers, and executing prisoners who knew too much about the machinery of genocide. Georg remained in his isolated cell, still building furniture, still waiting for whatever fate the collapsing Reich had planned for him. The camp commandant at Dachau received periodic reminders from Berlin that prisoner Elser was to be kept alive under all circumstances, that he remained the personal property of the Führer, that no harm was to come to him without explicit orders from the highest level. But as Soviet armies closed in from the east and American forces advanced from the west, those orders became increasingly difficult to follow, and the question of what to do with Hitler's special prisoner became more urgent. In April of 1945, as Allied armies approached Dachau and the Nazi regime entered its final death spiral, the SS received new orders regarding Georg Elser. The decision had been made at the highest levels of the collapsing government, possibly by Hitler himself in the Berlin bunker where he was preparing for suicide, or by Himmler acting on his own authority as he tried to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. Georg was to be eliminated, his existence erased, his story buried along with all the other inconvenient truths the Nazis wanted to hide from history. On April 9, 1945, exactly 29 days before the camp would be liberated by American forces, Georg Elser was taken from his cell by SS guards and walked toward the camp crematorium. He had survived 6 years of imprisonment, had outlasted most of the Nazi leadership who had interrogated him, had come within weeks of freedom and vindication. But the Reich had one final act of spite to inflict on the man who had nearly killed its Führer. The official record states that Georg Elser was shot during an Allied air raid, killed by falling debris as American bombers attacked the area around Dachau. This was a lie, a final piece of Nazi fiction designed to obscure a murder. Georg was executed with a single shot to the back of the head, his body cremated immediately, his death recorded in camp documents with deliberate vagueness to avoid questions later. The guards who killed him were acting on direct orders, eliminating a witness who could testify to how close the Nazi regime had come to destruction, how vulnerable Hitler had been, how a lone Carpenter had nearly succeeded where professional assassins and military coups had failed. Georg Elser died unknown, unmourned by a world that did not yet know his name. His ashes scattered with those of thousands of other victims, his story seemingly lost to the flames that consumed so much of the evidence of Nazi crimes. When American forces liberated Dachau on April 29, 1945, they found approximately 32,000 emaciated survivors and over 3,000 corpses scattered throughout the camp, evidence of a systematic program of murder that had operated with industrial efficiency for 12 years. The liberating soldiers documented everything they saw, photographing the gas chambers, the crematorium ovens still warm with human ash, the mass graves that stretched beyond the barbed wire perimeter. They interviewed survivors, collected Nazi documents that had not been destroyed, and began compiling evidence for the war crimes trials that would soon begin in Nuremberg. But among the thousands of prisoner files they recovered, Georg Elser's name appeared only as a footnote, a special prisoner who had died weeks before liberation under circumstances that remained deliberately unclear. The Americans had no idea who he was, what he had attempted, or how close he had come to preventing the war they had just spent 4 years fighting. His story remained buried in Nazi archives, classified information that would take decades to fully emerge. The first hints of Georg Elser's existence began surfacing during the Nuremberg trials when prosecutors questioned former Gestapo officials about the Bürgerbräukeler bombing. The Nazi defendants, desperate to deflect blame and minimize their own culpability, mentioned the case in passing, describing it as evidence that the regime had faced threats from within Germany, that not all Germans had supported Hitler. But the details were vague and contradictory, and the prosecutors focused on documenting larger crimes like the Holocaust and the invasion of Poland, did not pursue the matter deeply. The general public in both Germany and the Allied nations remained unaware that a lone Carpenter had nearly assassinated Hitler in 1939, that a single bomb had come within minutes of potentially preventing World War II. The story was too strange, too unlikely, and too uncomfortable for a world trying to understand how an entire nation had descended into genocidal madness. It was easier to believe that Germans had been universally complicit or universally victims than to acknowledge that individuals like Georg had resisted and failed. In the decades following the war, Germany struggled with its Nazi past, oscillating between denial and selective memory, between claiming collective victimhood and accepting collective guilt. The official narrative emphasized resistance groups like the White Rose or the military officers who had attempted to kill Hitler in the July 20, 1944 plot, stories that featured educated elites, aristocrats, and military heroes. These were resistance efforts that fit conventional notions of heroism organized conspiracies with manifestos and coordinated actions. Georg Elser's story did not fit this comfortable narrative. He was not a nobleman or an intellectual, not a military officer with access to Hitler's inner circle, not even a member of any organized resistance movement. He was a working-class carpenter who had acted entirely alone, motivated not by political ideology, but by simple moral clarity. His story suggested that ordinary Germans could have resisted, that the excuse of powerlessness was hollow, that individual action was possible even under totalitarianism. This was an uncomfortable truth that post-war Germany was not ready to confront. It was not until the 1960s and 70s that historians began seriously investigating the Berger-Breukele bombing and uncovering the full extent of Georg Elser's achievement. Archival research revealed the Gestapo interrogation transcripts, the technical analyses of the bomb, the timeline of events that had saved Hitler's life by pure chance. Journalists interviewed surviving relatives from Georg's village, people who remembered him as quiet and skilled, a man who kept his political opinions to himself but who had grown increasingly disturbed by the rise of Nazism. The picture that emerged was of someone extraordinary precisely because he was so ordinary, a craftsman who had applied his professional skills to the problem of tyrannicide with the same patience and precision he would use to build a cabinet. He had no superhuman abilities, no special training, no powerful allies. He simply had conviction, technical knowledge, and the courage to act when no one else would. The revelation of Georg Elser's story sparked intense debate in Germany about the nature of resistance and complicity. Some argued that his example proved individual Germans could have done more to oppose Hitler, that the claims of powerlessness were exposed as excuses by the fact that one man with hand tools had nearly succeeded where entire intelligence agencies had failed. Others countered that Georg's failure demonstrated the impossibility of effective resistance, that even the most meticulous planning and execution could be defeated by random chance, that his death proved the futility of opposing a totalitarian state. But both sides missed the deeper significance of what Georg had attempted. He had not acted because he believed he would succeed, or because he thought victory was certain, or because he had calculated favorable odds. He had acted because he believed it was necessary, because he understood that moral action does not depend on guaranteed outcomes, because he refused to be complicit through silence and inaction. By the 1980s and 90s, Georg Elser's name had begun appearing in German history textbooks, memorial exhibitions, and academic conferences dedicated to understanding resistance during the Third Reich. Survivors of Dachau who had encountered him briefly before his execution came forward with memories, describing him as quiet and dignified, a man who worked with wood in the camp workshops and never spoke about what he had done. Historians located the remnants of the Berger-Breukele pillar, which had been preserved as evidence by the Gestapo and stored in a Berlin warehouse that survived the war. Forensic analysis confirmed Georg's testimony about how he had carved the cavity, revealing tool marks consistent with hand chisels and the patient removal of wood over many nights. The technical sophistication of the bomb mechanism was reconstructed from interrogation records, and fragments recovered from the blast site, confirming that Georg had indeed designed and built the device himself without assistance. Every detail of his impossible story checked out, forcing historians to confront the reality that this lone carpenter had accomplished what seemed beyond the capabilities of professional assassins and intelligence operatives. The German government began formally recognizing Georg Elser as a resistance hero in the late 20th century, but the recognition came with ambivalence and controversy that reflected deeper anxieties about what his story represented. In 1997, a memorial plaque was installed in Munich at the site where the Berger-Breukele once stood, identifying Georg by name and describing his assassination attempt as an act of conscience against tyranny. In 2011, a permanent memorial was unveiled in Berlin, a steel sculpture showing Georg's profile alongside an inscription honoring him as someone who tried to prevent the war through individual action. But these memorials sparked backlash from some quarters of German society who argued that celebrating an assassin, even one targeting Hitler, normalized political violence and set a dangerous precedent. Critics pointed out that if Georg's bomb had succeeded, It would have killed not only Nazi leadership, but also ordinary party members and attendees at the beer hall, raising uncomfortable questions about whether terrorism could ever be justified, even against the most evil regime in history. These debates missed a crucial point that historians and ethicists have spent decades trying to articulate. Georg Elser was not a terrorist in any meaningful sense of that term. He did not target civilians randomly, did not seek to spread fear through indiscriminate violence, and did not kill for ideological purity or religious fanaticism. He identified the specific leaders responsible for launching a war of aggression and attempted to eliminate them before that war could begin, accepting the tragic reality that some bystanders might die in the process, but calculating that their deaths would be infinitely smaller than the millions who would perish if Hitler remained in power. This was not terrorism, but tyrannicide, an ancient concept with deep roots in Western political philosophy. The idea that killing a tyrant to prevent greater evil is not only morally permissible, but potentially obligatory. Georg understood something that much of the German population either did not see or refused to acknowledge in 1939. That Hitler was leading Germany toward catastrophe, that millions would die, and that stopping him was worth any personal cost. The mathematical reality of Georg's near success is staggering and haunting in equal measure. If the bomb had detonated 9 minutes earlier, if Hitler had maintained his usual schedule, if fog had not delayed his departure, the explosion would have killed him along with most of the Nazi inner circle. The war might not have been prevented entirely, but it would have been profoundly different. There would have been no blitzkrieg, no Operation Barbarossa, no systematic Holocaust machinery operating under Hitler's personal authority. The Nazi regime would have fragmented into competing factions fighting for control. The Wehrmacht would have lacked the charismatic dictator who drove them toward total war, and the possibility of negotiated peace in 1939 would have been exponentially greater. Historians have spent decades gaming out these alternative scenarios, and while no one can say with certainty what would have happened, the consensus is that tens of millions of lives would likely have been saved. Georg Elser came within 9 minutes of being the most important individual in 20th century history, the man who prevented World War II. But he failed, and the world paid the price. 50 million people died in the war that followed. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and civilization itself teetered on the edge of extinction. Georg watched the early years of this catastrophe from his concentration camp cell, knowing that he had tried and failed, that his 30 nights of patient work had been defeated by weather and chance, that history had pivoted on minutes. The weight of that knowledge must have been unbearable, the awareness that he had done everything a single person could do, and it had not been enough. Yet he never recanted, never expressed regret for the attempt, never suggested that trying to kill Hitler had been wrong. When interrogators asked him if he understood that assassination was a crime, he reportedly said that allowing Hitler to continue was the greater crime, that doing nothing in the face of evil was complicity, that he would make the same choice again, even knowing he would fail. The question that haunts anyone who studies Georg Elser's story is not why he tried to kill Hitler, but why so few others did. Germany in 1939 had a population of nearly 70 million people, including millions who privately opposed Nazism, who understood that Hitler was leading the country toward disaster, who watched the persecution of Jews and political enemies with growing horror. Yet out of those millions, only a handful attempted assassination, and only Georg came close to succeeding before the war had even begun. The explanations for this collective inaction are complex and disturbing, revealing uncomfortable truths about human nature and the mechanics of totalitarian control. Fear was certainly a factor, the knowledge that resistance meant torture and death not just for yourself, but for your family, that the Gestapo was omnipresent and informants were everywhere. But fear alone cannot explain the passivity, because some people like Georg overcame that fear and acted anyway. The deeper truth is that most people convinced themselves that someone else would solve the problem, that they were not capable of making a difference, that individual action was futile against the machinery of the state. Georg Elser proved all those assumptions wrong. He had no special advantages, no military training, no access to power, no organization backing him. He was a furniture maker with basic education and limited resources, someone who should have been insignificant in the grand sweep of history. But he refused to accept insignificance, refused to believe that ordinary people were powerless, refused to wait for someone else to take responsibility. He taught himself bomb-making from library books, stole explosives one stick at a time, spent a year planning an operation that professional assassins would have considered impossible, and came within 9 minutes of changing the course of the 20th century. His example demolishes the comfortable myth that resistance under totalitarianism is futile, that individuals cannot challenge state power, that ordinary people lack the capacity to influence history. Georg demonstrated that the barriers to action are primarily psychological rather than practical, that what separates collaboration from resistance is not capability, but choice, not resources, but will. This is why Georg Elser's story remains controversial and uncomfortable decades after his death. It forces us to confront questions we would prefer to avoid about complicity and courage, about when violence becomes necessary, about what we owe to future victims when we see evil unfolding before our eyes. Modern Germany has struggled to integrate Georg into the national narrative of resistance because he does not fit easily into any ideological category. He was not a communist, not a conservative, not a religious martyr, not a military officer bound by oaths and honor codes. He was simply a craftsman who looked at the trajectory of his country and decided that killing one man was morally preferable to allowing millions to die. This is a stark and brutal calculus that challenges our comfortable assumptions about non-violence and democratic values, forcing us to ask whether there are circumstances when assassination is not just permissible, but obligatory, when the failure to act becomes a form of moral cowardice. The United States, with its own history of political violence and assassination, has never fully grappled with what Georg Elser's example means for American political culture. The country was founded in part through armed resistance against perceived tyranny, celebrates figures like John Brown who used violence against slavery, and maintains a cultural mythology around individual action against corrupt power. Yet the assassination of Lincoln, McKinley, and Kennedy created a strong taboo against political murder, a consensus that democratic societies must resolve conflicts through voting and debate rather than bullets and bombs. Georg's story exposes the tension in this position, asking what citizens should do when democratic institutions have been destroyed, when voting is meaningless, when debate is punished by death. At what point does the obligation to prevent mass murder override the prohibition against political violence? When does the refusal to kill one person become complicity in the deaths of millions? These are not abstract philosophical questions, but urgent practical dilemmas that have recurred throughout history and will recur again. Georg Elser faced them in 1939 Germany and chose action over inaction, violence over complicity, individual responsibility over collective paralysis. His choice cost him 6 years of imprisonment and ultimately his life, but it also demonstrated that resistance is always possible, that tyranny is never invincible, that one person with conviction and technical skill can shake the foundations of even the most brutal regime. The fact that he failed does not diminish the significance of the attempt, because the attempt itself proved that failure was not inevitable, that Hitler was vulnerable, that the Nazi state could be challenged by ordinary people willing to risk everything. Georg carved a cavity into a wooden pillar and filled it with explosives. But more importantly, he carved out a space in history where individual moral action reasserted itself against totalitarian control. Today, Georg Elser's name remains largely unknown outside Germany, absent from most American history textbooks, unmentioned in the standard narratives of World War II that focus on Allied military victories and heroic battles. When Americans think about resistance to Hitler, they recall stories like Schindler's List or the Monuments Men, narratives that fit comfortably within Hollywood conventions of heroism and redemption. Georg's story resists that kind of packaging because it is too ambiguous, too morally complex, too willing to confront the ugly truth that stopping evil sometimes requires getting your hands dirty. He was not a savior who rescued innocents, not a soldier who fought with honor, not a martyr who died peacefully for his beliefs. He was a man who tried to commit mass murder in pursuit of preventing greater mass murder, who failed through no fault of his own, and who died anonymously in a concentration camp weeks before liberation. There are no clear heroes in his story, no satisfying resolution, no moment of triumph to celebrate. There is only the haunting knowledge that history pivoted on 9 minutes, and that those 9 minutes cost 50 million lives. The technical achievement of what Georg accomplished deserves recognition independent of the moral questions. With no formal training, working entirely alone, he designed and built a sophisticated timing device that functioned flawlessly, carved a cavity into a reinforced pillar over 30 consecutive nights without detection, and placed a bomb that would have killed its target if not for an unpredictable weather delay. This was not luck or amateur improvisation, but the result of meticulous planning, patient execution, and extraordinary technical skill applied to an impossible problem. Modern security experts who have studied Georg's methods describe them as brilliant, noting that his approach would still work today against many protected targets, that the principles he applied remain sound decades later. He proved that determined individuals with practical skills pose a far greater threat to power than large conspiratorial organizations, that lone actors are nearly impossible to detect before they strike, that the vulnerability of even the most protected leaders remains a permanent feature of human society. But the deeper legacy of Georg Elser is not technical but moral. The question he poses to every generation about the obligations of individuals living under tyranny or observing the rise of authoritarian movements. His life asks whether we have the courage to act when we see catastrophe approaching, whether we will accept the psychological comfort of believing ourselves powerless, whether we will wait for someone else to take responsibility for preventing evil. These questions are not historical artifacts from 1939, but living issues that confront citizens in every country where democratic norms are eroding, where demagogues are rising, where the machinery of mass violence is being constructed before our eyes. Georg did not have the advantage of hindsight, did not know for certain that Hitler would launch a world war and genocide, but he understood enough to act on incomplete information, to make a moral bet that killing one man was justified by the probability of preventing catastrophic harm. He was willing to be wrong, willing to accept the consequences, willing to trade his own life for the possibility of saving millions. The story of the carpenter who spent 30 nights carving a bomb into a pillar has been buried by history, suppressed by the Nazis who wanted to hide their vulnerability, ignored by post-war narratives that preferred simpler tales of good and evil, forgotten by a world that moved on from World War II without fully reckoning with how close it came to never happening. Georg Elser deserved to be remembered not as a failed assassin, but as someone who understood what most of his contemporaries refused to see. That individual action matters, that moral responsibility cannot be outsourced to governments or organizations, that the choice to resist or collaborate is ultimately personal. He proved that one person with hand tools and conviction can threaten empires, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, that the only guarantee of failure is the decision not to try. 9 minutes separated Georg Elser from being the most important person of the 20th century, the man who prevented World War II by killing Adolf Hitler before the invasion of Poland. Those 9 minutes lost to fog and an impatient dictator's schedule became the difference between 50 million deaths and a world that might have avoided the worst catastrophe in human history. We cannot know what that alternate timeline would have looked like, cannot say with certainty that Georg's success would have prevented all the horrors that followed. But we know that he tried when almost no one else did, that he came impossibly close to succeeding, and that his failure was a matter of chance rather than inadequacy. The wooden pillar at the Bürgerbräukeller held a bomb that should have detonated while Hitler stood before it, but it also held something more enduring, proof that resistance is always possible, that tyranny is never invincible, and that the actions of ordinary people can echo across history even when they fail. Georg Elser's story is not ultimately about assassination or warfare or the contingency of historical events. It is about the moment when one person decides that doing nothing is unacceptable, that the future matters more than personal safety, and that some fights are worth having even when victory is not guaranteed. That moment, multiplied across millions of individuals, is the only real defense against tyranny. Georg understood this. He carved it into wood and packed it with explosives, and then he waited for history to arrive.